My name is Sandra, and I'm an alcoholic. So weird up here. I'd like to thank Kirk for asking me to speak here tonight. Can you hear me okay? My sobriety date is Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1989. God willing, this Valentine's Day I'll be 30 years sober. You can do it. Who would have thunk, you know? Like Steve was saying, I grew up in the 60s, and it was a lot different then. We just partied and got up the next day and went to work. I'm going to catch my breath a lot up here. I have COPD, so it's really hard to breathe. But I can breathe. Actually, I think I'll rest. I don't remember the first time that I picked up a drink, but I remember the first time I got drunk. I was about 15. I drank all kinds of alcohol, threw up all over the place, and it just felt like from that time on, that's how I drank and that's how I used, as hard as I could and as much as I could. Through my teenage years, we did a lot of barbiturates, reds, yellows. Those things aren't even around anymore. Quaaludes. Cocaine was huge. Acid, all the fun stuff. And we had fun. By 1971, I had a child, my son, and then in 74, I had my daughter, Jenny. I was married. I got divorced, moved to my mom's. And that's when I really started using a lot more drugs, is when I was living at my mom's house. It was a great place to be, great place for my kids, but I was miserable. I was working a lot of jobs to try to make ends meet, and it was really hard. I remember a friend of mine, I was dating this guy, Les, and we'd do things like get up in the morning, drink some mezcal, take some magic mushrooms, drive to Mexico, go to Husong's Cantina and drink margaritas. I don't even know how we got back from that stuff, but we always did, and we used hard. I never used a needle, smoked some heroin, but I never did any kind of heroin. Once my kids got older, I stopped the drugs and started drinking, and I started drinking vodka straight out of a bottle every day. That took me down. It took me a couple of years of really hard drinking for it to just bring me straight to my knees. And I could go on about my drunk-a-log all day. It's like everyone else's, I think. I remember going to a place in Anaheim Hills, and I was married at the time. And I went in to this bar called the Foxfire, in case anybody's from Anaheim Hills. And I blacked out in there, and I left with some guy. Most of it I don't remember. The part I remember is waking up in the back of a van, naked in the woods with somebody that I didn't know. He got me back to my car. I mean, he could have killed me. Nobody would have ever known where I was. And that wasn't the first time that happened. That happened a lot. And I had 2 kids at home. And the hard part was trying to walk back in and look at my husband after that. So I divorced the guy. Made that easier. And then my daughter had a field trip on a boat out in the Dana Point Harbor, big, pirate boat. And I volunteered to go on this trip with them. And I remember thinking to myself, how am I going to get vodka on this boat? And So, we're brilliant at figuring those things out. And by the time I got to the Dana Point Harbor, I was in a blackout. And in front of all of her friends. And they're like in the 5th grade. And some ladies took me back into a building there, and they laid me down. And the next thing I remember, I woke up, and my mom was driving, and my son was with her. And I'll never forget the look on their face when they looked at me back there in that back seat. And that wasn't as hard as it was looking at my daughter when she came back from that trip. So I knew I was in trouble. Took my kids to school one day. 8 o'clock in the morning, I was shaking so hard. And I had a bottle of vodka under the bathroom sink, and I went home, and I took a big gulp of it and started puking my guts out as hard as I could. And I remember shaking so hard and holding on to that sink and looking in the mirror and thinking, I didn't think, what is a nice mom like me doing in a situation like this? I thought, if I can keep that next drink down, I'll be all right. And I did that a lot. It was nothing to pull a hot bottle of vodka out of underneath the seat of my car on a summer day in California and down it. I drove drunk. I drove drunk with my kids in the car. I drove drunk with my neighbors' kids in the car. It is by the grace of God that I didn't kill somebody or myself. So I decided to take myself to treatment. Nobody had to make me go. And back in those days, this is in 1989, they didn't have treatment centers like they do today. They were more freestanding places. I had some insurance through my work. Man, what a crazy-ass place that was. And it was really fun. I fit right in that crazy place. It was a 35-day treatment center. I stayed 35 days. And they had me look at a list of halfway houses to look at. I looked at them. I picked one out. It was in Laguna Beach on a street named Roundsville. And this little guy in a suit came and picked me up, and he had a little Volkswagen. It didn't have a dashboard. It had a bumper sticker that said my other car went up my nose. And I thought, I'm going with this guy. I'm liking the house, and I haven't seen it yet. So I wound up going there, and there was a guy there by the name of Dr. Jim Nugent. And he came walking out. I was sitting in the dining room, and he said, what is a nice lady like you doing in a place like this? I said, I was been asking myself that. And I wound up staying there for about 35, 40 days. And I was only about 35 days sober when I got there. And he asked me if I wanted to be a house manager for some women down in Newport Beach. And so I went down, looked. What a nightmare. But this was on the boardwalk, so I could have cared less. And so I said, yeah, I'll do it. And it was a tall building. It was called the Sand Castle on 18th Street in Newport. And we had 12 women on the first floor, 12 men on the second floor, and co-ed on the third floor. And a dumbwaiter in between all those. It was in that house with all of those women that I really learned how to get sober. We had meetings every night, and it was at that round table that they called me on my crap. And when I was about 3 months sober, about 90 days sober, I'm at that house, at that little recovery house, and my mom and my stepdad and both of my children showed up at the door, and I knew that something was wrong. And they were there to tell me that my dad had died. And I was only 90 days sober. And so I went to the funeral, and I think that this is really important. I went to the funeral. I'd listened to what everybody had been saying to me in AA and all that stuff and everything on the walls, and I had been listening. And I'm sitting in the car, you know, after they had buried my dad, and I'm in this car and we're driving to his house, and this feeling came over me, and I didn't know what it was. I'd never felt it before in my life. I had no idea. But it was a calmness. And we got back to my dad's house, and as we drove down the driveway, my dad was a good old boy from the South. I mean, he used to make moonshine. Come on. And Bobby Joe. And my relatives was there. I mean, I saw the alcohol glistening in the sunlight, thinking, who would blame me? My dad just died. So I went down that driveway, and I stayed just long enough because I heard someone tell me in AA one time that if you're in an uncomfortable situation, get out. I got out. I left. I went to my mom's house. My mom and dad had both been remarried, and after I stayed at my mom's house for a while, I ran back to that recovery home. I couldn't get back there fast enough. And I called my sponsor, met with my sponsor, and I talked to her about that feeling. And she said, that feeling is we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. I just didn't know that that was it. So I went on, you know, I was loving sobriety. My son was out by this time trying to kill himself with drugs and alcohol, in and out of jail in Orange County. You know, he used out there really hard. He used everything that you could, and I think they used horse needles at one time to just, you know, get a little more in there. But he used for 14 years. He used for the first 10 years of my recovery. And it was really hard being sober and watching my kid die and disintegrate. But I stayed working in recovery, and on my 2-year birthday, and the reason I talk about all this stuff is because you guys are young, and just because you get sober, life is going to go on. Boy, did I learn that the hard way. So now I'm 2 years sober. Actually, when I was 1 year sober, I was dating this guy because they told me not to. And his name was Harley Smith. And we had a lot of fun together, and we were sober, and he was a heroin addict. And the bottom line is, he came over to my house, and he was giving a lady a cake in L.A. one night at a meeting, and he went out to a recovery house. He was listening to some guy's fifth step, and went in the bathroom and said, I'll be out in just a minute. And he went in and tied his arm off and shot up and died with that needle in his arm. That was after my dad's funeral. You know, by that time, I'm a year sober, and I'm at Harley's funeral. And when I was at Harley's funeral, what I thought is, when I went up there and looked at him in that casket, I thought, you know what? You didn't do anything I didn't do. I just got away with it, you didn't. And I never have to put myself in that place of doing that again. But that one ripped me up pretty good. And then at 2 years sober, I got a call from my mother. Love my mom, Ruby now. You know, she reminded me of like Lucy, you know, Lucille Ball, that air. And she was tall and pretty. And she called me at work. And she would never call me at work if it wasn't urgent. And she said, I'm really nauseous, and I don't know why. You know, and I need to, can you come and take me to the doctors? And I went and I picked her up, took her to St. Joseph. They kept her in there, ran tests. And she was in there for about 4 days. And she came home, I think on a Friday, and she died that night in her bathroom. Well, no, she went down in her bathroom. They took her to the hospital and did surgery, and she died in surgery. She had an aneurysm of her aorta. My dad had a heart attack. And so now I'm at my mother's funeral. That was a hard thing with a couple of years of sobriety to do, was to bury my mother. A girl who lives here in Prescott now, we were in the recovery home together. She went with me to the, I don't even know what it's called, where they bury you, but where they fix you in the casket. But I did my mom's hair and I did her makeup. And some people would think that that's really morbid. But I didn't think so. I thought that was about me and my mom. She was pretty. I let her hair be the way she liked it. Put her makeup on. My knees buckled. But I felt her spirit all around me, and I felt that we had really come full circle. And so now I'm at another funeral. And that was a tough one. I remember Carl Mosen, who was the owner of Sober Living by the Sea out in Newport. He was my boss, and he called me and he asked me, he said, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" And I said, "You can give me a little money so I can buy some better clothes for my kids to wear to my mom's funeral." And in just a few minutes, some cash showed up at the door, and my house filled up with women. And that's what this program does. You know, it fills up with people who care. So I got through my mom's funeral, and then after about 3 or 4 years, 5 years, I'm still working in recovery, and it isn't all bad. And so I decided I'd start flying airplanes. Doesn't everybody do that? And I met a guy in Florida, and him and I were flying airplanes together. We were taking lessons out of John Wayne Airport. I had a blast. You don't ever want to do that drunk. I had the alternator in the plane go out. I was out over the ocean. But we got in, and we got in safe. I flew all over Florida, all over the place. I had a blast in some of those years. And then I met a guy in an AA chat room on the computer before people met people on the computer. They didn't even have any of that. And what we had in common is that the guy that I was flying airplanes with crashed. You know, I thought for a long time, people shouldn't date me. It's probably not a good idea. Everybody's dying. But Mike and I, you know, the guy I was flying the planes with, we went all over the place. It was one of the best times of my life. And then I met this guy that I started dating, and we met on the computer. He was from South Carolina, and I was in Huntington Beach. We had a long-distance relationship for about a year, kind of going back and forth. And then him and I took off. He was 18 years sober, and I was about 6 years sober. And we took off, and we traveled across the United States for about a year and a half. We pulled a Pace trailer with a Harley Davidson in it, and some computer equipment and all of our clothes. And my daughter was 20, and she goes, "You can't do this." And I said, "I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm going to do this." And she goes, "You're going to go with some guy that's going to kill you." I go, "He's not going to kill me." But long story short, Joe and I traveled for a long time, and then we wound up here in Prescott. And the reason we got here to Prescott is because my son got sober. And then he got drunk, and then he got sober, and then he got put in jail here in Prescott. And I remember for a year, I had to drive by the courthouse and see Mike in the orange jumpsuit raking the leaves at the courthouse square. He had They were cooking meth, and he was in Albertsons before it was what it is now, and he was stealing something off the shelf, and he had a needle in his pocket, and he saw out of the corner of the eye a manager coming, and he took that needle out of his pocket, and the manager jumped him, and it stabbed the manager. So he got a year in jail, and after he got out of jail, he went to treatment with Jim Nugent, and he stayed there for about a year, and now he's about 20, let's see, Mike is about 21 years sober. That was a long time ago. And now he's got all these kids. I have all these grandkids. I'm going to open up a house just for them because they're all going to need it, I guarantee you. Think about it. They come to me and ask me these questions. They think I'm the cool grandma, if they only knew. But you know, I've worked in the field. I stayed sober. I've been through a lot. Joe and I were together for about 16 years, and in 2009, he got cancer. He got lung cancer, small cell lung cancer, and he called me and he said, it's bad. So in 2009, I stayed with him for, he passed away 6 months and 1 day from diagnosis. And the last month of his life, he suffered horribly. It was terrible. I quit smoking in 2007. I haven't had a cigarette since. And man, I loved smoking and cigars and all that stuff, you know. But it really will kill you. So this past 12 years has been really tough with COPD. But I get around and I make it okay. You know, I'm going to do it till I can't do it anymore. And that's about my story. I don't have a whole lot else to talk about. I'm still here. I'm still sober. I love being sober. You guys are all young, man. Go to meetings, get a sponsor, do what they tell you to do. Work the steps, you know. It works. I'm here to say it works. Thank you for letting me share.
Another round of applause for Sandra.